This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of England, from the Accession of James II by Thomas Babington, Macaulay. Book 1, Chapter 1, Part 5. After the wars of York and Lancaster, the links which connected the nobility and the commonalty became closer and more numerous than ever. The extent of destruction which had fallen on the old aristocracy may be inferred from a single circumstance. In the year 1451, Henry VI summoned 53 temporal lords to Parliament. The temporal lords summoned by Henry VII to the Parliament of 1485 were only 29, and of these several had recently been elevated to the peerage. During the following century, the ranks of the nobility were largely recruited from among the gentry. The constitution of the House of Commons tended greatly to promote the salutary intermixture of classes. The knight of the shire was the connecting link between the baron and the shopkeeper. On the same benches on which sate the goldsmiths, drapers, and grocers, who had been returned to Parliament by the commercial towns, sat also the members who in any other country would have been called noblemen, hereditary lords of manors, entitled to hold courts and to bear coat armour, and able to trace back an honourable descent through many generations. Some of them were younger sons and brothers of lords. Others could boast of even royal blood. At length the eldest son of an Earl of Bedford, called in courtesy by the second title of his father, offered himself as candidate for a seat in the House of Commons, and his example was followed by others. Seated in that House, the heirs of the great peers naturally became as zealous for its privileges as any of the humble burgesses with whom they were mingled. Thus our democracy was from an early period the most aristocratic, and our aristocracy the most democratic in the world, a peculiarity which has lasted down to the present day, and which has produced many important moral and political effects. The government of Henry VII, of his son, and of his grandchildren was, on the whole, more arbitrary than that of the Plantagenets. Personal character may in some degree explain the difference, for courage and force of will were common to all the men and women of the House of Tudor. They exercised their power during a period of 120 years, always with vigour, often with violence, sometimes with cruelty. They, in imitation of the dynasty which had preceded them, occasionally invaded the rights of the subject, occasionally exacted taxes under the names of loans and gifts, and occasionally dispensed with penal statutes. Nay, though they never presumed to enact any permanent law by their own authority, they occasionally took upon themselves, when Parliament was not sitting, to meet temporary exigencies by temporary edicts. It was, however, impossible for the Tudors to carry oppression beyond a certain point, for they had no armed force, and they were surrounded by an armed people. Their palace was guarded by a few domestics, whom the array of a single shire or of a single ward of London could with ease have overpowered. These haughty princes were therefore under restraint stronger than that any mere law can impose, under a restraint which did not indeed prevent them from sometimes treating an individual in an arbitrary and even in a barbarous manner, but which eventually secured the nation against general and long-continued oppression. They might safely be tyrants within the precinct of the court, but it was necessary for them to watch with constant anxiety the temper of the country. Henry VIII, for example, encountered no opposition when he wished to send Buckingham and Surrey, Anne Boleyn and Lady Salisbury to the scaffold. But when, without the consent of Parliament, he demanded of his subjects a contribution amounting to 1/6 of their goods, he soon found it necessary to retract. The cry of hundreds of thousands was that they were English and not French, freemen and not slaves. In Kent the royal commissioners fled for their lives. In Suffolk 4,000 men appeared in arms. The king's lieutenants in that county vainly exerted themselves to raise an army. Those who did not join in the insurrection declared that they would not fight against their brethren in such a quarrel. Henry, proud and self-willed as he was, shrank not without reason from a conflict with the roused spirit of the nation. He had before his eyes the fate of his predecessors, who had perished at Berkeley and Pomfret. He not only cancelled his illegal commissions, he not only granted a general pardon to all the malcontents, but he publicly and solemnly apologised for his infraction of the laws. His conduct on this occasion well illustrates the whole policy of his house. The temper of the princes of that line was hot and their spirits high, but they understood the character of the nation that they governed, and never once, like some of their predecessors and some of their successors, carried obstinacy to a fatal point. The discretion of the Tudors was such that their power, though it was often resisted, was never subverted. The reign of every one of them was disturbed by formidable discontents, but the government was always able either to soothe the mutineers or to conquer and punish them. Sometimes, by timely concessions, it succeeded in averting civil hostilities, but in general it stood firm and called for help on the nation. The nation obeyed the call, rallied round the sovereign, and enabled him to quell the disaffected minority. Thus, from the age of Henry III to the age of Elizabeth, England grew and flourished under a polity which contained the germ of our present institutions, and which, though not very exactly defined or very exactly observed, was yet effectually prevented from degenerating into despotism by the awe in which the governors stood of the spirit and strength of the governed. But such a polity is suited only to a particular stage in the progress of society. The same causes which produce a division of labour in the peaceful arts must at length make war a distinct science and a distinct trade. A time arrives when the use of arms begins to occupy the entire attention of a separate class. It soon appears that peasants and burghers, however brave, are unable to stand their ground against veteran soldiers, whose whole life is a preparation for the day of battle, whose nerves have been braced by long familiarity with danger, and whose movements have all the precision of clockwork. It is found that the defence of nations can no longer be safely entrusted to warriors taken from the plough or the loom for a campaign of 40 days. If any state forms a great regular army, the bordering states must imitate the example, or must submit to a foreign yoke. But where a great regular army exists, limited monarchy, such as it was in the Middle Ages, can exist no longer. The sovereign is at once emancipated from what had been the chief restraint on his power, and he inevitably becomes absolute, unless he is subject to checks such as would be superfluous in a society where all are soldiers occasionally and none permanently. With the danger came also the means of escape. In the monarchies of the Middle Ages, the power of the sword belonged to the prince, but the power of the purse belonged to the nation. And the progress of civilization, as it made the sword of the prince more and more formidable to the nation, made the purse of the nation more and more necessary to the prince. His hereditary revenues would no longer suffice, even for the expenses of civil government. It was utterly impossible that without a regular and extensive system of taxation he could keep in constant efficiency a great body of disciplined troops. The policy which the parliamentary assemblies of Europe ought to have adopted was to take their stand firmly on the constitutional right to give or withhold money, and resolutely to refuse funds for the support of armies till ample securities had been provided against despotism. This wise policy was followed in our country alone. In the neighbouring kingdoms great military establishments were formed. No new safeguards for public liberty were devised, and the consequence was that the old parliamentary institutions everywhere ceased to exist. In France, where they had always been feeble, they languished and at length died of mere weakness. In Spain, where they had been strong as in any part of Europe, they struggled fiercely for life, but struggled too late. The mechanics of Toledo and Valladolid vainly defended the privilege of the Castilian Cortes against the veteran battalions of Charles V, as vainly in the next generation did the citizens of Saragossa stand up against Philip II for the old constitution of Aragon. One after another, the great national councils of the continental monarchies, councils once scarcely less proud and powerful than those which sate at Westminster, sank into utter insignificance. If they met merely as our convocation now meets, to go through some venerable forms. In England events took a different course. This singular felicity she owed chiefly to her insular situation. Before the end of the 15th century, great military establishments were indispensable to the dignity, and even to the safety, of the French and Castilian monarchies. If either of these two powers had disarmed, it would soon have been compelled to submit to the dictation of the other. But England, protected by the sea against invasion, and rarely engaged in warlike operations on the continent, was not as yet under the necessity of employing regular troops. The 16th century, the 17th century, found her still without a standing army. At the commencement of the 17th century political science had made considerable progress. The fate of the Spanish Cortes and of the French States General had given solemn warning to our Parliaments, and our Parliaments, fully aware of the nature and magnitude of the danger, adopted in good time a system of tactics which, for after a contest protracted through 3 generations, was at length successful. Almost every writer who has treated of that contest has been desirous to show that his own party was the party which was struggling to preserve the old constitution unaltered. The truth, however, is that the old constitution could not be preserved unaltered. A law beyond the control of human wisdom had decreed that there should no longer be governments of that peculiar class which in the 14th and 15th century had been common throughout Europe. The question, therefore, was not whether our polity should undergo a change, but what the nature of the change should be. The introduction of a new and mighty force had disturbed the old equilibrium, and had turned one limited monarchy after another into an absolute monarchy. What had happened elsewhere would assuredly have happened here, unless the balance had been redressed by a greater transfer of power from the Crown to the Parliament. Our princes were about to have at their command means of coercion such as no Plantagenet or Tudor had ever possessed. They must inevitably have become despots, unless they had been at the same time placed under restraints to which no Plantagenet or Tudor had ever been subject. It seems certain, therefore, that had none but political causes been at work, the 17th century would not have passed away without a fierce conflict between our kings and their parliaments. But other causes of perhaps greater potency contributed to produce the same effect. While the government of the Tudors was in its highest vigour, an event took place which has coloured the destinies of all Christian nations, and in an especial manner the destinies of England. Twice during the Middle Ages the mind of Europe had risen up against the domination of Rome. The first insurrection broke out in the south of France. The energy of Innocent III, the zeal of the young orders of Francis and Dominic, and the ferocity of the Crusaders whom the priesthood let loose on an unwarlike population, crushed the Albigensian churches. The second Reformation had its origin in England, and spread to Bohemia, the Council of Constance, by removing some ecclesiastical disorders which had given scandal to Christendom, and the princes of Europe, by unsparingly using fire and sword against the heretics, succeeded in arresting and turning back the movement. Nor is this much to be lamented. The sympathies of a Protestant, it is true, will naturally be on the side of the Albigensians and of the Lollards. Yet an enlightened and temperate Protestant will perhaps be disposed to doubt whether the success either of the Albigensians or of the Lollards would, on the whole, have promoted the happiness and virtue of mankind. Corrupt as the Church of Rome was, there is reason to believe that if the Church had been overthrown in the 12th or even in the 14th century, the vacant space would have been occupied by some system more corrupt still. There was then, throughout the greater part of Europe, very little knowledge, and that little was confined to the clergy. Not one man in 500 could have spelled his way through a psalm. Books were few and costly. The art of printing was unknown. copies of the Bible, inferior in beauty and clearness to those which every cottager may now command, sold for prices which many priests could not afford to give. It was obviously impossible that the laity should search the Scriptures for themselves. It is probable, therefore, that as soon as they have put off one spiritual yoke, they would have put on another, and that the power lately exercised by the clergy of the Church of Rome would have passed to a far worse class of teachers. The 16th century was comparatively a time of light. Yet even in the 16th century a considerable number of those who quitted the old religion followed the first confident and plausible guide who offered himself, and were soon led into errors far more serious than those which they had renounced. Thus Matthias and Nipodoling, apostles of lust, robbery, and murder, were able for a time to rule great cities. In a darker age such false prophets might have founded empires, and Christianity might have been distorted into a cruel and licentious superstition, more noxious not only than Popery, but even than Islamism. About 100 years after the rising of the Council of Constance, that great change emphatically called the Reformation began. The fullness of time was now come. The clergy were no longer the sole or the chief depositories of knowledge. The invention of printing had furnished the assailants of the Church with a mighty weapon which had been wanting to their predecessors. The study of the ancient writers, the rapid development of the powers of the modern languages, the unprecedented activity which was displayed in every department of literature, the political state of Europe, the vices of the Roman court, the exactions of the Roman chancery, the jealousy with which the wealth and privileges of the clergy were naturally regarded by laymen, the jealousy with which the Italian ascendancy was naturally regarded by men born on our side of the Alps, all these things gave to the teachers of the new theology an advantage which they perfectly understood how to use. Those who hold that the influence of the Church of Rome in the Dark Ages was on the whole beneficial to mankind may yet, with perfect consistency, regard the Reformation as an inestimable blessing. The leading strings which preserve and uphold the infant would impede the full-grown man. And so the very means by which the human mind is at one stage of its progress supported and propelled may in another stage be mere hindrances. There is a season in the life both of an individual and of a society at which submission and faith, such as at a later period would justly be called civility and credulity, are useful qualities. The child who teachably and undoubtingly listens to the instructions of his elders is likely to improve rapidly. But the man who should receive with childlike docility every assertion and dogma uttered by another man no wiser than himself would become contemptible. It is the same with communities. The childhood of the European nations was passed under the tutelage of the clergy. The ascendancy of the sacerdotal order was long ago the ascendancy which naturally and properly belongs to intellectual superiority. The priests, with all their faults, were by far the wisest portion of society. It was therefore on the whole good that they should be respected and obeyed. The encroachments of the ecclesiastical power on the province of the civil power produced much more happiness than misery. While the ecclesiastical power was in the hands of the only class that had studied history, philosophy, and public law, and while the civil power was in the hands of savage chiefs who could not read their own grants and edicts, but a change took place. Knowledge gradually spread among laymen. At the commencement of the 16th century, many of them were in every intellectual attainment fully equal to the most enlightened of their spiritual pastors. Thenceforward that dominion, which during the Dark Ages had been, in spite of many abuses, a legitimate and salutary guardianship, became unjust and noxious tyranny. From the time when the barbarians overran the Western Empire to the time of the revival of letters, the influence of the Church of Rome had been generally favourable to science, to civilization, and to good government. But during the last 3 centuries, to stunt the growth of the human mind has been her chief object. Throughout Christendom, whatever advance has been made in knowledge, in freedom, in wealth, and in the arts of life, has been made in spite of her, and has everywhere been in inverse proportion to her power. The loveliest and most fertile provinces of Europe have, under her rule, been sunk in poverty, in political servitude, and in intellectual torpor, while Protestant countries, once proverbial for sterility and barbarism, have been turned by skill and industry into gardens, and can boast of a long list of heroes and statesmen, philosophers and poets. Whoever, knowing what Italy and Scotland naturally are, and what 400 years ago they actually were, shall now compare the country round Rome with the country round Edinburgh, will be able to form some judgment as to the tendency of papal domination. The descent of Spain, once the first among monarchies, to the lowest depths of degradation. The elevation of Holland, in spite of many natural disadvantages, to a position such as no commonwealth so small has ever reached, teach the same lesson. Whoever passes in Germany from a Roman Catholic to a Protestant principality, in Switzerland from a Roman Catholic to a Protestant canton, in Ireland from a Roman Catholic to a Protestant county, finds that he has passed from a lower to a higher grade of civilization. On the other side of the Atlantic the same law prevails. The Protestants of the United States have left far behind them the Roman Catholics of Mexico, Peru, and Brazil. The Roman Catholics of Lower Canada remain inert, while the whole continent round them is in a ferment with Protestant activity and enterprise. The French have doubtless shown an energy and an intelligence which, even when misdirected, have justly entitled them to be called a great people. But this apparent exception, when examined, will be found to confirm the rule, for in no country that is called Roman Catholic has the Roman Catholic Church during several generations possessed so little authority as in France. The literature of France is justly held in high esteem throughout the world, but if we deduct from that literature all that belongs to four parties which have been, on different grounds, in rebellion against the papal domination, all that belongs to the Protestants, all that belongs to the assertors of Gallican liberties, all that belongs to the Jansenists, and all that belongs to the philosophers, how much will be left? It is difficult to say whether England owes more to the Roman Catholic religion or to the Reformation. For the amalgamation of races and for the abolition of villenage she is chiefly indebted to the influence which the priesthood in the Middle Ages exercised over the laity. For political and intellectual freedom, and for all the blessings which political and intellectual freedom have brought in their train, she is chiefly indebted to the great rebellion of the laity against the priesthood. The struggle between the old and the new theology in our country was long, and the events sometimes seemed doubtful. There were two extreme parties prepared to act with violence or to suffer with stubborn resolution. Between them lay, during a considerable time, a middle party, which blended very illogically, but by no means unnaturally, lessons learned in the nursery with the sermons of the modern evangelists, and while clinging with fondness to all observances, yet detested abuses with which those observances were closely connected. Men in such a frame of mind were willing to obey, almost with thankfulness, the dictation of an able ruler, who spared them the trouble of judging for themselves, and raising a firm and commanding voice above the uproar of controversy, told them how to worship and what to believe. It is not strange, therefore, that the Tudors should have been able to exercise a great influence on ecclesiastical affairs, nor is it strange that their influence should, for the most part, have been exercised with a view to their own interest. End of Part 5.